Listen up, class. History will respect this subject, or else. Now pay attention, or you're all getting detention.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm John McKay. I am the Cranky Old Historian, and today I think I'll talk for a few minutes about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is teaching history. I was a teacher for a number of years, 32 to be precise, and roughly half of those I spent in the classroom, mostly high school, but some middle school classroom, teaching U.S. history, world history, military history, some specialty subjects, things like that. First off, though, have you noticed we have a new studio here? Yes. Ain't it grand? This is the library and study of the Castle McKay and ongoing Soirée. And welcome here today. I hope you've enjoyed some of the previous videos. Been trying to talk kind of around history before I really get too much diving deep. Like I've said before, I've gotten several suggestions. People really wanted to hear me rant about various things. And I have a cousin who's really into history. He sent me a long list of things. And yes, I am working on those. So yeah, it's not going to be just these surveys of different weirdisms and bits and pieces of teaching history. If you see me looking up, I've got a new monitor up there, and it's just not in a good place. I don't like it. So if you see me looking up a lot, just kind of ignore me. If you see me waving my hands around a lot, ignore that too, please. But teaching history, everybody has to take it. It's taught from elementary school on the way up through college, university, at least the first couple of years of college, as a mandatory required course. And why is that? Why do we require history? Well, you know, I'm a historian. Of course, I'm going to say it's because it's the most important subject there is, and it is. But the real reason is you got to have a foundation. It's sort of like saying, well, you know, instead of just messing around with, you know, math and trigonometry and algebra, why don't we just start the second graders off in calculus? That would work, right? Well, no. You have to have the basics. You have to have a foundation. And that's why history tends not to be taught very well, or at least explained very well. At least why we're teaching it a certain way. We teach history beginning in the elementary school years as just facts. Okay, Columbus discovered America in the modern era. Yes, there were people before him, but let's just ignore that. We're looking at big picture kind of stuff. Yes, we are the United States of America. Yes, we started with 13 colonies. Yes, we separated away from Great Britain. And then these are the facts. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay, yeah, that's a fact.
In 1492, Christopher Columbus had a goal so new. He wanted to find a quicker way to trade with Asia far away.
And honestly, when people think history, a lot of the times they're always going about, oh, it's so boring, it's just facts and all that. That's not history, that's chronology. But you've got to know it first. You have to have this foundation. And this foundation where, okay, if I say, okay, well, let's talk about Columbus and what he brought to this continent. It's like, okay, well, who was Columbus? Well, yeah, you got to know that, and you've got to kind of know the story. So in elementary school, you know, when you're a kid, when you're young, and okay, let's just keep it just to the simple facts that, you know, an 8, 9, 10-year-old can understand. All right, no problem. Let's keep it to facts. In middle school, we start, you know, getting a little bit more complicated. You know, let's put a couple of facts together, and then we can start talking about events. Okay, what happened when Columbus arrived in the so-called New World? Well, what happened? So, well, you know that there was this and you know there was that. So you could put these together and say, okay, well, this is what happened. Then in high school, which is what I primarily taught, and again, it's taught at 3 different levels normally in most high schools. Standard issue U.S. history, say, for example, honors U.S. history, and advanced placement U.S. history. I really liked teaching AP U.S. history, APUSH as it was called, because for 2 things. Number one, you had your very, very, very best history students. Now, these kids sometimes were also really good at math and science, but most of the time not. If you're really good at the soft stuff like history and psychology and sociology and anthropology and all that, you tend to have to be thinking about it in a different way in your brain than someone who is really good with math. I am not. My dad was a math guy all the way. But, I'm an adult survivor of an engineer parent. And what he could understand, I struggled. I went all the way through Calculus 3 and calculus-based physics in college because originally I intended to become an architect. And I got up there and I could handle it. I was hanging on by my fingernails, but I could handle it. I just didn't enjoy it. And finally, my wife and I talked, and I changed majors from engineering down to history, or over to history, I should say. A lot of people said it was down. I think it was over. And history to me is fascinating when in high school, when you get there and you're really starting to say, okay, in elementary school, we talked about facts. In middle school, we talked about events. And now let's talk a little bit about analysis. What did it mean for Columbus to come to the New World? What kind of effects did it have, both where he left in Europe and in the Americas? And this is where it starts getting interesting. And also, you can start getting into what I really love, and that's just simply telling stories. To me, a really, really good historian is a great storyteller. He can tell you the facts and all of that stuff, but he weaves it into a story where it's actually interesting, because we're talking about people, and people are goofy and stupid all throughout history. And sometimes they're goofy and stupid in funny sorts of ways. And that makes it even better. So this is what I like doing. I love doing it. I really love doing that. AP history was good because you had really high quality students. You didn't have to spend a lot of time on classroom management, hardly any. And that's a big downfall in middle and high school. Classroom management is difficult. How you get everybody just awake and more or less paying attention and moving forward, and not like burning down the bookshelves or something, or whatever. Or doing what I did when I was in high school and have the book I was actually reading inside my textbook because the textbooks were boring, and I'm going to get to that in a second. And then in college, of course, you go further and you go into much more depth. And you go into a lot of analysis. You're expected to know the foundational facts. And then you build. So you see how everything's just kind of built on each other. You're building foundations. And then you get up to a college level, and it's like, okay, now let's talk about analysis. And let's see what you think about these things. And for the first time, instead of just regurgitating facts or regurgitating what the instructor or the teacher or the professor wants, you're expected to come up with new stuff. I got high praise one time from a history professor. He wrote me a letter of recommendation for my first teaching job, and in there he wrote, I'm occasionally capable of original thought. And at the time I went, what? And then I thought, that's actually is pretty good. That's pretty high praise, especially coming from him. It was high praise. I was proud of that. But getting back to AP for a second, the downfall of AP is you are teaching to a test. And everybody's heard about this, and everybody universally goes, this is bad. AP tests are hard, and they're very difficult for a very good reason. And what it is you're trying to teach a college level history class in that depth to high schoolers who are still learning foundational stuff at the same time. So it's kind of a hybrid sort of class. So you get in there and sort of do both of these things at once. And then you have this big test at 3 weeks before the year ends, and then they're exhausted. And for 3 weeks we sat there and watched movies because there was nothing more I could do for them because they had really advanced so much further. And introducing these kids to the rigor of what university and college life is like. That's another big part of AP, how to study. I ran a course called How to Study towards the beginning of the year after I shocked everybody who came into one of my AP classes. Now, I also taught AP government, and every year I would, interview these middle school students because I taught it in the ninth grade. And we were handpicking the geeks out of middle school. And I would interview them, and I'd say, okay, have you ever failed a class? And they would laugh at me. I've never even failed a test. Well, we're going to see about this. Because unless you have failed, you cannot succeed. You do not know how to succeed. So I taught a week-long intro to political philosophy for that first week of AP government to these ninth graders. And within 5 minutes of the first class, you could see you could see the panic in their eyes. And at the end of that, I had a test. It was a pass-fail test. And I'm here to tell you that John Locke himself could not have passed that test. I could not have passed that test, being in their same shoes. I only asked 2 questions, and they were both essay questions, and it had to do greatly in depth with the 5 books they had to read that week. I was infamous for that. Now, of course, everybody failed, and I knew they'd failed. That's why I called it the Kobayashi Maru. And if you know that reference, you're a friend of mine. They come back the next week all freaked out, and there's parent conferences. Oh, my parents are calling. I'm like, wait, let me talk to them. And then the next week, I come back. Okay, everybody failed. You don't know how to study, which most of them didn't, because they were so bright they were just able to go on their own. So I'm going to teach you how to study, and then we're going to try this again, and let's see what we do. And I tell you what, if you'll at least pass the next 2 quizzes, and you don't have to make an A, but if you can pass them, then I'll throw this one out. Well, I was planning on throwing it out anyhow because it was ridiculous, but it was a wake-up call, and it worked very well. And I made some of these kids be twitchy for the rest of their life because, I had one young lady that every time I did this, I would pass out the test, and she'd break out hysterically laughing and crying all at the same time. So it was, successful. At least I got my point across. Sorry I made you twitchy. But anyhow, getting back to this. This is why we teach history, is to teach you foundational facts. And to start introducing you to the process of putting facts together and understanding them. And if you look at the political rhetoric of today, it's real clear a lot of people did not have a class like this. They have a little fact here and there. They don't know how to evaluate that fact. Is it true? Is it false? Is this propaganda? Is this analysis? What is it? And they don't know how to do that. So part of history is to teach you how to analyze things. Was Washington a really great president? Who was the worst president of the 19th century, which was Buchanan, by the way? Who was the worst president of the 20th century? Well, that's getting into touchy territory. And it was Jimmy Carter. But let's not get into that because people get upset. And this is what I mean. If you start analyzing that, an analytic person would say the next question would be, what do you mean by that? Why do you say that? And, I'll be glad to. I could talk at length about that. As you know, I can talk at length because y'all are following this channel. But anyhow, getting back to teaching history, one of the big complaints is textbooks. Why are textbooks so universally bad? And here's the thing, if you look at the authors, usually it's a whole pile of people. Most of the time a committee is formed to write a textbook. And the textbook is like watching grass grow. I mean, I've yet to run into a really good textbook. There may be one out there, and there's some that are okay, especially the AP level ones. They're okay, but they're not really all that great. And you don't sit down and, I think I'm going to have some light reading from my high school history textbook. You don't do that in the evenings. And why is that? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, again, we're trying to teach foundational facts. And so you don't want a lot of extra stuff in there. Textbooks of these days, of more lately, have gotten into sidebars and let's talk about this funny little story, or here's a little highlight about this guy. That's great. That's a story. That's to keep you involved. But the second reason textbooks are so bad is they're looking at their market. 2 states, California, and Texas, buy textbooks for the entire state. I'm not sure about California, but I know Texas does this. So, and they buy massive numbers. So they're able to say, hey, we want you to kind of lean the narrative this way. When you're only teaching facts, the only way you can do that is either by leaving out some facts or overemphasizing others, or both. And that's what ends up happening. Okay, we've got Texas, at least so far, is relatively conservative. So if we lean it to kind of a more conservative length, okay, then we're going to sell a passel of textbooks to Texas and all the states that follow them. You know, whatever Texas is buying, we're going to get onto that. Textbooks are expensive. So this is why. And then California is very liberal. So if California wants it, you know, they want it kind of leaned another way, you can emphasize other parts of history and de-emphasize some parts. And then the liberal states will follow suit. So this is why textbooks are the way they are. So if I'm teaching you history, and let's say that I'm a university level, if you'll notice, a lot of university level history courses do not have a textbook. There are textbooks written for them, but a lot of professors do not use them for this very reason. I can have you read the actual source materials. And we talked about writing history in one of my previous videos. And this is what this is all about. How can we analyze original documents? How can we take something that's said and then, okay, was this accurately analyzed to begin with? Case in point, and this is from 20th century. In the 1950s, there was a number of very controversial figures. Joe McCarthy, Alger Hiss, I'm trying to remember some of their names, that there was this big fight going on. We were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of underhanded things going on, a lot of attempts to influence the U.S. government by means other than voting or petitioning the government. And Joe McCarthy, for example, claimed that there was X number of communists in the State Department. And he waved around some papers, and he did some things. The way he did it was easy to attack the messenger rather than the message, and that's what happened. And he was roundly criticized, and he became a pariah. He became somebody that only a very small section of America still had any trust in by the 1960s. But then the Soviet Union fell in 1991, and the records opened up, and you know something? He was dead on correct. He's absolutely correct. And matter of fact, he understated by a significant number how many outright communists were in the State Department during that time. And we have learned in the last year, you know, just think about this, how many actions of government are not what they seemed like. This is why it is so important to study history. Okay, where have we come from? Have we done this before? Like the young people today, I'm reading on X and I'm reading on Facebook, which magnifies some marginal opinions, in my opinion. And, you know, you've got these young people, they're, oh, well, communism's never really been tried, and it's wonderful, it's socialism. If you take Social Security, you're supporting socialism. You missed that economics course, did you? This is why it's so important. We've been here before. We have seen what happens in other countries. And as a matter of fact, today, which is April 17th, 2026, back in 1975, this is the day that Pol Pot took over Cambodia. And we ended up with the killing fields there. This was socialism run amok. So you can look at this and say, this is a huge, huge warning. How can we let this happen again? You look and see what happened in Europe in the 1930s, and in some ways you're seeing a lot of repeats in Europe going on the same way. And it's getting kind of uncomfortable because people of my age and older, I'm a baby boomer, you know, we remember very well what happened there in the 30s and 40s. We weren't there, but our parents talked about it at length. And we're seeing this happen again. This is why you study history. So why is it taught so badly? Well, number one, like I said earlier, people are remembering just learning the facts, names and dates and facts in general, and facts in general, generals and battles. That's it. Names and dates and battles and generals. That's what I always say. Yeah, that's boring. And then high school's more difficult. You're going through a lot of personal issues. Everybody is. And on top of that, you got big bearded old guys like me trying to teach you how to analyze things that you're not particularly interested in at that time. And then later in life, you start getting interested in history because you've lived through some of it. And you're like, wow, this is interesting to read. And that's when you discover how bad journalism is. It's like, well, I was at that event and it does not resemble anything like what I went through, what this person's talking about. I've had that happen a number of times. So you discover a lot of things as you're growing that make you more interested in history. But not only just the material itself, but then especially over the last 20 years or so, you have what I call activist teachers coming in. And this is a big thing today, and we talk about, and it's talked about a lot today. Why do we have so many teachers that, I want to tell you about my sex life, and I want to tell you about this, and I want to tell you about that has nothing to do with the subject at hand. And that's why I call them activist teachers. They're not there to actually teach you the subject. They're there to indoctrinate you in their political ideas. And we have way, way too many of those in the history field. And what they do is they use history, they take things, like when you're talking about faith and Christianity. If you take things out of context, you can warp them all sorts of ways. And the same in history. You can warp them all sorts of ways. Well, Columbus was a genocidal, homicidal maniac. He was anything but that, if you really understood what was going on at the time. And the Native Americans he encountered were peaceful and lived together. That's actually funny if you understand the history of Native Americans. All people around the world have acted the same way. That's what you start discovering. And the problem with teaching history correctly to these activist teachers is you might start thinking for yourself. And that's what they do not want you to do. They want you to follow what they say. They want you to listen to their propaganda and just absorb it. And either reject it and be with their enemy, or to absorb it and be one of them. When truth and facts and accurate retelling of events and accurate analysis of them paint different pictures. And they can paint different pictures to different people. What happened to those two unfortunate individuals who were killed in the anti-ICE protests up in Minneapolis? Well, one side has one take on it, another side has a very different 180 degree. So where's the truth in that? Where does the truth lie? And that is what history is all about. You're trying to decide what happened. Okay, is the accounting of the events accurate? And that's very, very important. And then you take that and you say, okay, these events, how did they interact with each other? And then what does it mean? And that's difficult to teach. I tried, and I tried very hard for many years to learn how to be a good history teacher, and I was not one by any stretch of the imagination. I enjoyed the subject. I enjoyed my students. I enjoyed my job a lot, teaching it, but I wasn't very good at it. The problem was I don't think I ever really got a lot of my students up to that good analytic level where they could go out and, after I got done with them at least, and say, okay, well, here's this event, and here's how they conflict, and here's how they emphasize each other and things like that. So that's why history is taught. How history is taught it depends. You've got weirdos like me, and I was constantly in trouble with my leaderships, and I was actually fired from one teaching job for doing this, is because I was a lecturer. To me, history is something that you learn about through reading and hearing about it. a lot of things that I don't see how you can play a little game or run around and collect scraps on the wall, which I saw one teacher doing, and I don't understand that. To do history, that is. How you can do all this other stuff. I did projects, and I think those are great if they're done correctly. But it's by and large a lecture class. And people don't like listening anymore. They have the attention span of gnats. I think the reason that my channel here is not doing all that great, which is fine with me, I'm just doing this for my fun, is because these are so long. And the things I'm doing, the warm words of wisdom, things that I do that are only 3 minutes long are doing fantastic. But people have the attention span of gnats. So they don't want to listen to this whole thing. But that's the best way. You listen to it, you read it, you think about it, and then you write something about it. And this is important. And writing history is where you really start learning how history works. And that's why so many people write history. There's so many history books. Case in point, I was born in Atlanta. I'm born in Carrollton, actually. Raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Live up here in Northwest Georgia. I live very close to the site of several Civil War battles. I'm interested in the Atlanta campaign. And I have 2 full bookshelves up here of nothing but books specifically on the Atlanta campaign. And they're all different. And that makes them fascinating. History is not a static thing. History changes in terms of how you think about it, in terms of the effect. There's an old saying that you cannot properly evaluate an historical event until at least 50 years have gone by. Okay, I saw some the other day, historians agree that Trump is the worst president in history. Oh, that's ridiculous. And no historian worth his salt would ever say such a thing. You need to put everything in context. Just right now, we're coming through the mid-70s and looking at them. And right now, 50 years ago, we were at the end of Gerald Ford's presidency and Jimmy Carter was about to come in. And we can look and see what Nixon did. And Nixon was very, very good at foreign policy. He was not very good at other things. Not a very bad president. LBJ has been reevaluated. Not on the top. I don't think he's on anybody's top 10 list. Then Kennedy before him, Eisenhower. These are people we're talking about. Anybody from Carter on, you really can't talk much about. They're not fully in context yet. Obama, the 2 Bushes, Trump, Biden, you really can't talk about them yet because they're not, enough time has not passed. And people say, well, that's ridiculous. We need to know about them now so we know how to vote and how to do this. Well, in theory, that's the job of journalists, is to write what I call immediate history. And something happened and a book, before the smoke clears, there's a book out about it. And y'all have heard about this. Or somebody got in trouble and they write a book immediately. O.J. Simpson murders his wife and her boyfriend and then writes a book, what if I did it, or how I would have done it, or whatever it was, or I did it, but I'm not going to admit it in this book, or whatever the title of the book was. These are immediate history things. And they're usually there to make a point or to advance a narrative most of the time. Sometimes you get somebody who says, I was in this thing and it really shook me up and I needed to write about it. There's a great book called Am I Alive? And there's a Civil War battlefield up here in Northwest Georgia called New Hope Church. I'm going to talk about that in another reel later. It was the site of a really vicious, nasty, costly Civil War battle. And then in 1977, an airliner crashed right on top of the battlefield. I mean, directly on top of what had been the Confederate lines. I mean, my Lord, it was just wow. A lot of people were killed. Both of the pilots were killed, but the 2 flight attendants survived somehow. And one of them, and I can't think of her name off the top of my head, wrote a book called Am I Alive? This is an immediate history book. It was a very good book. It was a memoir. And probably that's a better way just to call these books. They're memoirs. This is my memory of what happened. This is what I went through. And it's interesting. What does it mean in the context of things? Well, we now know enough time has passed where you can start to see what this event, this airliner crash, what it changed. Well, for example, one of the things that changed was how weather radars are constructed and used. That was a key factor in the crash of that aircraft. And yeah, just some other things. There was a runway it possibly could have made, but the air traffic controllers were not aware of it for whatever reason, or at least that's the story I've heard. History can be fascinating when you move beyond all of this that I've been talking about, all the facts, the events, the analysis, and then you move into the stories, the anecdotal stories. This is what I find fascinating. The oral histories, when people are talking about, well, this is what I experienced. And I'll leave you with one last example of what I find is fascinating history. When I was in high school, a man named Donald Boyette, I believe his last name was, and Pett will correct me here, wrote a book called Currahee. And it talked about his time as a paratrooper with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne in World War II. And in there, he wrote, when he landed in Normandy, and they were fighting in Normandy, and during the first days of the invasion there, he talked about how he ran into some Japanese soldiers in German uniforms. He thought, why are there Japanese soldiers in Normandy? Well, I mean, that's a little, I mean, it was like a sentence maybe. And that kind of stuck with me. And later on, I actually became a Currahee in the very same company he had been in, Company A, 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry. And it came out many, many years later that what had happened was, what he saw were not Japanese, they were Koreans. And what had happened was, when Japan went into Korea, they captured these Korean soldiers. Then when they got into a fight with Russia, the Russians captured them, put them on the Eastern Front. Germans were fighting them there. The Germans captured them and sent them to Normandy to be basically cannon fodder, and they were killed during the American invasion there. So think about this. This is fascinating. But just one little line, this one little anecdote, and it opened up this whole thing, and nobody had really looked at this before. It's a minor little fact, but it's terribly interesting, and it shows you just how complex that war was, not just in the grand scheme of things, but in the details as well. And that's why we study history. We are making history. A popular phrase these days with people is, well, we're making history. We're doing this. We're doing that. You're making history when you get out of bed in the morning. Now, whether the history will ever be written down, I don't know. But this is why we teach it. So everybody that we're around, in theory at least, has the same basic foundational facts, the same basic understanding of events, and then in analysis, at least they're working with the same set of facts. If you try to say, well, Columbus was a myth, it was actually aliens from planet Zunu that did this. Okay, you're not working with the same basic facts as the rest of us. So, you see what I mean? And this is why we teach history. A lot of people don't teach it very well because they find it boring too, or they're not good at it, or they don't understand it themselves, or for whatever reason. Teaching high school is hard. Teaching middle school is harder. You're dealing with a lot of you're dealing with a lot of growth issues with the kids. You're dealing with a lot of other things going on that are distracting. These kids are getting ready for adulthood, and they feel like adults, though they're not there yet. And then they don't want to be adults a few years later. That's why you hear so much talk about adulting. And then at the same time, you've got people like me up there going, hey, let's look at this in depth, because you will need this in the future. To understand how things work, to understand why things happen, you need to understand this first. And that is why we teach history. Hope you've enjoyed me babbling just for a minute about this. And thank you for coming back, and I hope to see you again here on the Cranky Old Historian. Have a great, great day.